There is something frank and joyous and young in the open face of the country. It gives itself ungrudgingly to the moods of the season, holding nothing back. The air and the earth are curiously mated and intermingled, as if the one were the breath of the other.
This is a quote from Willa Cather's novel, O Pioneers. In this novel, we drop in on main character Alexandra as she struggles to keep her farm going and settle her family on the wide open spaces of the American prairie. The novel gives you a look at the suffering and successes of pioneers as they navigate their way through the daily experiences of the American West. In her article, The Enclosure of America, Civilization and Confinement in Willa Cather's O Pioneers, Melissa Ryan dives into the writing of Willa Cather and analyzes how Alexandra's domestication of her land and her home paralleled the shrinking of the wild prairie. In the novel, Alexandra tries to combat this enclosure, but can only look at the untouched land with nostalgia, as Americanization is imminent. Ryan brings up how many tend to, quote, romanticize the wild Willa of the prairie, end quote. Oh, Willa, how we love you. With Cather's hometown being just a short drive away, how can Nebraskans not relate to her in some way? As Dr. O'Malley points out, she evokes the truth and beauty within the nature of our state and the surrounding land. She writes about us, the past of us, and the future of us, the typical people of America. She takes a look at perspectives beyond her own and lets us all participate in her stories by leaving emotional situations up for interpretation. We connect, we draw our own conclusions, and we feel our own journeys through the stories she tells us. As Ryan points out, her, quote, talents had no real scope in the drawing rooms of New York and London, end quote. She drew ideas from her life and the experiences of home.
When taking a closer look at Ryan's interpretations of the American West, we find a connection between Cather's writing about the wilderness of the prairie and the Americanization of the time period. When Ryan writes, quote, the pioneers in Cather's first novel of the soil encounter an overwhelming vastness, fierce, savage, and uninterrupted, end quote. I am reminded of Thoreau's writings. Cather understands the beauty and power of nature. She does a beautiful job of displaying this for us all in her novels, especially in O Pioneers. I can only imagine the excitement Thoreau would have if Cather accepted an invitation of his to take a walk. The beauty that would come from that walk would be remarkable. Alexandra, our main character in the novel, displays a deep anxiety about taming that natural wilderness. Her domestication results in a shrinking of the wild land. Ryan says Cather attempts to teach us what it means to, quote, tame, cultivate, or perhaps to discipline the wilderness, end quote. While Alexandra takes pride in her family's successful attempts to build a home, she also stresses over the, quote, shrinking of the territory that occurs because of her domestication. As an attempt to reverse the shrinking, she proposes that all should use the land as a redemptive source of freedom, or the original asylum of America. It's discovered that her westward gaze can only be nostalgic, when most are turning from nature, not to it.
Ryan goes so far as to note how Cather does not mention Native Americans within the novel. She writes, quote, the Indian is perhaps the most culturally potent figure for untamed landscape, and the removal of native populations was the historical act of enclosure most fundamentally linked to the spirit of the pioneer, end quote. Americans moving west attempted to tame what was at that time the wilderness of our nation. This was seen as an enclosure, a reduction of the freedom found within that land. Although Cather chose to leave out Native Americans in O Pioneers, her obsession with the enclosure of the land forces readers to identify an unwritten text or a shadow on the page. She's challenging us to see the historical references that are often ignored. Again, she is leaving it open to our interpretation and wants us to participate as a reader. Ryan builds her arguments about the enclosure of our western wilderness with the support of Mitchell Foucault. In his article, Discipline and Punish, the Birth of the Prison, Foucault explains that, quote, discipline proceeds from the distribution of individuals in space and sometimes requires enclosure, land for the purpose of productivity and the reconfiguration of social or human space for the same purpose, end quote. We restrict the freedom of human beings by enclosing them in a prison. Cather's character Alexandra is revealing to us that, in a similar manner, we restricted the freedom and natural existence of our land by enclosing it with Americanization. Alexandra's domestication is a form of imprisonment for the wild land she and her family are settling. She can't ignore it and can't avoid it. As Foucault states in support of Ryan's ideas, to move our social and productive existence forward, we must enclose the land around us. As I look back over the readings this semester, I can't help but bring up Thoreau one more time to end my presentation. I believe Ryan would appreciate the support Thoreau provides for her theory without even trying. Thoreau understands, like Ryan, that, quote, we go eastward to realize history and study the works of art and literature, retracing the steps of the race. We go westward as into the future, with a spirit of enterprise and adventure, end quote. Enclosure of the land means progress of the human. Cather shows us the inevitable of this progress through the journey of Alexandra and her pioneering family. However, Thoreau also agrees with Ryan in her attempts to explain the importance of the West as a wild land. Alexandra offers the land up as a kind of freedom. Thoreau writes, quote, every sunset which I witness inspires me with the desire to go to a West as distant and as fair as that into which the sun goes down, end quote. The open wilderness is our inspiration, our unknown. It beckons to us and draws us in. However, Ryan believes that, in O Pioneers, Alexandra proves to us that in order to grow and modernize, humans must enclose that land, settle it, Americanize it. It's hard to accept when Thoreau so beautifully writes, quote, life consists with wilderness. The most alive is the wildest, end quote. However, the progress of America as a nation doesn't happen without the enclosure of the American West.